the Septuagint was copied down from the original Hebrew language. So when people say they're looking up the Hebrew, they're actually looking up the Masoretic, which was written 1,000 years after the Septuagint. They're looking up the Hebrew that was copied down from the Greek. It's been a really interesting study that I've gotten into. We're talking about a non-Jewish, non-Christian king who had the Septuagint written down. So now we're going to get into the non-Christian, non-biblical sources and what they say about Jesus. Okay, Tacitus, a Roman senator and historian from AD 115, says, "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christ, from whom their name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate." Next one, Pliny the Younger, Roman governor from AD 112, says, "They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a god, and bound themselves by solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when it should be called upon to deliver it up, which it was their custom to separate, then reassemble to partake of food." Lucian of Samosata, a 2nd century Greek satirist, said, "The Christians worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account." Marabar, a Syrian philosopher, says, "What benefit did the Athenians obtain by putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as judgment for their crime, or the people of Samos for burning Pythagoras. In one moment their country was covered in sand, or the Jews by murdering their wise king." Phlegon, a historian from AD 140, says, "Jesus, while alive, was of no assistance to himself, but that he rose after death and exhibited the marks of his punishment and showed how his hands had been pierced by nails." Suetonius, Roman historian, "Because the Jews at Rome caused constant disturbances at the instigation of Christ, he expelled them," talking about Claudius, "from their city." Celsus, this guy is anti-Christian, but you'll see some of the stuff that he writes brings up some interesting points. It says, "Jesus had come from a village in Judea, was the son of a poor Jewess who gained her living by the work of her own hands. His mother had been turned out of the doors by her husband, who was a carpenter by trade, on being convicted of adultery. Being thus driven away by her husband and wandering about in disgrace, she gave birth to Jesus, a bastard. Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there he acquired certain magical powers which Egyptians pride themselves on possessing. He returned home highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them gave himself out to be a god." Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian, AD 93. This is good stuff right here. "At this time, there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They had reported that he appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah," Jewish guy admitting this, "concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders. And the tribe of Christians, so named after him, have not dispersed to this day." Again, that's Josephus, a Jewish historian, and Jewish historian called him Jesus, which is interesting. So we take these non-Christian, non-biblical sources, and we paint a picture what they say about Jesus. They say that Jesus was a real man, that his followers thought he was God. He was called the Christ. He caused a Jewish disturbance. He was allegedly born of a virgin. He was the father of a carpenter. He had miraculous powers. He was a wise man. His followers reported a resurrection. He was executed under Pilate. He was a wise king. The Jews wanted him dead. His teachings remain to this day. He predicted the future, and he rose after his death and showed signs of his crucifixion. Pretty amazing. They seem to tell the exact same story as the other manuscripts. One thing that I forgot to mention when talking about the manuscripts is we can put together an entire copy of the New Testament, with the exception of 11 verses, just from the teachings and sermons of the early church fathers. And we don't have 24,000 of those. We have over 86,000 of those. Probably should have mentioned that earlier. So, pretty amazing stuff.